Our presentation is War and the Nature of Conflict by Lexi, Leo, Anthony, and myself. So, what are the broad issues? There's so many different roads that war and the nature of conflict could take, such as cyber attacks, hacks, data breaches, fake news, drone strikes, AI fighting, futuristic weapons, unmanned aircraft missions, and the list goes on. So broadly, these new types of conflict are really based around causing harm, inconveniencing people, or upsetting infrastructure from a distance, specifically, it seems, without man-to-man contact. As a group, we'll be focusing on something that has been specifically referred to as information warfare. Before I get to the direction we took, I'll give a quick background as to how we got there. Through some research and reading, I made it to a paper by the Federation of American Scientists, or FAS, who said that information warfare in its broadest sense is a struggle that involves the communication process, a struggle that began with the advent of human communication and conflict, and the rapid rise in information and communication has revolutionized the communication process, and with it, the significance and implications of information warfare. In modern society, the FAS has outlined 4 critical, extremely interrelated infrastructures that, if attacked, could mean conflict or war. First is the power grid, which supports the entire system. Second is the communications infrastructure, allowing the exchange of news, business, research, social media, etc. Third is the financial infrastructure, which allows money to flow. And fourth is the transportation infrastructure, which allows rapid and massive transportation of people and goods. Modern battles potentially mean wars, conflicts, and strikes against these types of infrastructures, often by way of cyber attacks, guided AI missiles, or man's discretion. So, to finally narrow it down, we are focusing on attacks against the backbone of these interrelated power structures, the power grid, by way of cyberspace and AI. By attacking power grids, attackers gain the upper hand in controlling communication, the financial sector, and transportation, all of which are required in the running of a successful state. So, what is really at stake? In a broad sense, through attacks on power grids by drones, AI, and through networks, the ability to lead our developed, normal lives is at stake and has already been lost where these power grid attacks have taken place. They're disruptions to normal, functioning societies. Almost not a hyperbole, the potential loss of liberty, personal freedom, and normalness can be lost for a few clicks of a few buttons by other state governments, non-governmental organizations, terrorist groups, or ideological groups, just to name a few. The thing at stake when you're a victim to these types of quasi-wars and conflicts is not necessarily the loss of life or physical pain, but instead societal hardships, potential displacement, and loss of security.
As a society, we are constantly striving to continue moving forward. This means we place a strong value on innovation and live in a world where we are constantly searching for new ways to apply technology. This makes it difficult to gauge how devastating a power grid attack could be in the future. To start, we will look at what could happen if there was a power grid attack now. Then we will explore the implications this could hold for the future to show how important this issue is to consider. The power grid is currently essential for hospital care, food preservation, computer operations like the ability to work in financial systems, at-home medical devices for the sick, elderly, and disabled. A successful attack on the grid can result in cell service failing, garbage being left out in the streets to rot, no internet, and national panic. Clean water can become scarce, and travel becomes an impossibility as planes are unable to fly, trains are unable to run, and gas stations are unable to pump gas. The economy would be crippled by billions of dollars, and provided the attack were successful and wide scale enough, there would be a large spike in deaths from hospitals with power outages lasting up to multiple weeks. In addition, there is the danger of looting and chaos within cities that struggle to function without any sources of electricity. The effects would be devastating. In 2003, there was what is now known as the Northeast Blackout, in which a power line in Ohio burnt out and triggered a grid collapse due to an alarm system failure. The result was a power outage that affected 50 million people for 2 days, resulting in 11 deaths and an estimated $6 billion in cost. Even in an outage this short, there were many nightmare scenarios. Subway systems taking over 2 hours to be evacuated, roller coasters stuck mid-ride, and elevators frozen mid-level. However, America got off shockingly easy here, with the New York Stock Exchange being able to remain functional due to backup generators, and many hospitals dealing with it the same way. The power was restored before the lack of resources, such as water, became deadly. This attack that caused 11 deaths and $6 billion in cost was incredibly far from a worst case scenario. So, why is this something likely to become more important over time? In the future, we can assume these negative effects to multiply as we move towards a more technology heavy time. Innovations in health can result in more people reliant on electricity using machines that are then vulnerable in a power outage. On top of this, we must consider that the more common daily tasks we have streamlined by technology, the greater the chaos is in a power grid attack. From garbage collecting trucks to elevators to computers, we can see how we as a society have managed to utilize technology to make everyday life easier and more efficient. On larger scale, we have the stock market, the internet, and cell service that we rely on to thrive economically. These things that make life easier also make it more dangerous in a blackout scenario. We can only guess at what technologies the future may hold, but it is reasonable to assume that there will be a greater amount then than there is today. We must be cautious when innovating at how reliant we are on electricity on both large and small scales, so we do not present enemies with the opportunity to completely cripple our nation in a single attack.
So the question is, who is involved in the cyber attacks of the power grid? We have identified 3 key groups, and the potential aggressors, those are the ones who carry out the cyber attacks. And in this case, the aggressors can be both state and non-state actors. And of course, state actors with access to more resources will likely to be able to carry out attacks of larger scale. And potential victims in this case can be any individual that need access to electricity. And the cyber attacks of the power grid potentially would target critical infrastructure sectors of a given country. Those are the key infrastructure sectors that whose destruction would mean the demise of national security or security of the economy in the given country. So this graph shows you the supply of electricity in modern society, and it sort of really gives you the idea that how prevalent the use of electricity is in a modern society and what it would mean and how many different professions and industries will be affected in the case of a cyber attack of the power grid. So the conclusion is potentially all human beings connected to electronics or relying on electricity-related technology or services in their daily lives are likely to be involved in the case of a cyber attack of the power grid. And unlike traditional types of warfare, citizens and people living their daily lives are likely to find themselves at the center stage of those cyber attacks instead of just military institutions or infrastructures. So where is the power decentralized, or rather, where's the power decentralized? So it is important to know that, of course, state actors are still going to be more capable of carrying out cyber attacks as targeting foreign power grids. But compared to traditional types of warfare, it's actually likely to have far less advantage over individuals and NGOs. And this really comes to the idea that there's a decentralization of the power when it comes to potential cyber attacks. And one significant reason for that is, of course, many hacker groups would likely to have the capability to launch large-scale cyber attacks against a state-owned power grid and without any significant state sponsorship. Of course, there are governments who hire specific hacker groups to target government of another state. But really, the the relatively low entry cost of cyber attacks would mean that any sort of hacker group would not necessarily need a sizable donation or a state sponsorship to carry out cyber attacks against power grid. And of course, informational system expertise and access to networks would be the only prerequisite of carrying out such attacks. So let's talk about deterrent measures of state. So as far as our research goes, there are currently no effective deterrent measure that would 100% make sure that 100% prevent cyber attacks of power grid on the state level from happening. And in the U.S. case, one deterrent measure or one potential deterrent measure the U.S. government specifically claimed is that the U.S. government would regard any sort of attempts of successful or failed cyber attacks of the country's power grid as physical invasion of the land of the United States. And similarly, the Chinese government also invented the idea of the cyberspace and claimed that the Chinese government has full sovereignty over the cyberspace in China. And however, since there can be non-state actors involved in those cyber attacks, those measures will hardly be effective, as many individuals carrying out the cyber attacks in the past have remained at large. So in terms of mitigation options, one mitigation option for consequences of cyber attacks is that the encouragement of the usage of wind and solar energy would help mitigate large disastrous consequences of cyber attacks. Also, decentralization of power plant and building backup power plant would ensure that in the case of cyber attacks, states can recover quicker. Also, besides those mitigation options, the pre-attack measures such as exercising manual operation of the power grid or exercising recovery operation in the case of a cyber attack of the power grid would be essential to mitigate in the case of a cyber attack.
Okay, now let's talk about some more specific cases of war and the nature of conflict in the future. But first, I think it's important that we define what this is. So war is, by definition, the state of armed conflict between different nations or states or different groups within a nation or state. The definition of conflict, however, is more broad because it can apply across from things like a physical altercation, but even a clashing of ideas, principles, beliefs, and more. However, where the two meet and arguably most fit for this case going forward would be warfare. And warfare is a combination of both of the two previous ones, where warfare is engaging in acts related to both conflict and war. Now, a very recent example of warfare could be Russia and how it had election interference in the USA. Election interference is a very specific type of attack on the power grid. The goal, however, is not to cause physical damage such as a massive power outage, but rather it is to persuade the people to vote for a specific candidate, or in some cases, such as the 2016 election again, Hackers infected poll machines and attempted to even delete or alter votes to try to get a certain someone elected. This is a method of political destabilization, or again, pushes for a specific leader be elected. And another example of this could be seen when the CIA destabilized multiple governments, most prevalently those of banana republics, such as the coup d'etat in Guatemala, which led from a democratically elected leader to it being replaced by a military dictatorship for the benefit of the United States. However, going forward into the future, this is probably what's going to be more the common threat. WannaCry, also known as WannaCrypt, was a computer virus that became a worldwide epidemic in 2017. What the problem was is it was a self-spreading worm that spread to over 200,000 computers in just one day worldwide. The worm would encrypt files on infected computers before locking the user out and demanding a ransom be paid via Bitcoin transaction. If the payments were not made within the first 3 days, the cost would double. If payments were still not made in the next following 3 days, the information would then be deleted. WannaCry was not stopped until the discovery of a kill switch, but that was not before it had infected a hospital in the UK. That's terrible because it can lock out the people from relevant information of patients. So an entire hospital was shut down effectively because of a computer virus. However, a kill switch, as previously mentioned, was found and the virus was able to be stopped at that point. It did estimatedly around $4 billion USD in damages. The takeaway here, however, is WannaCry, if targeting major infrastructure, could have been a much more severe attack. Infrastructure such as nuclear power plants and railway systems being shut down or otherwise compromised could lead to the death or injury of hundreds of thousands of human lives. And it's important that going forward, that we understand that viruses can be engineered to exploit critical infrastructure and incapable of holding an entire nation at ransom. That is what the future of war and conflict could look like.